Tens of thousands of people demonstrated against the poll tax in central London, rallying in Trafalgar Square.
The subject of tonight's meeting is how we can stop the cuts, drawing on the lessons of what was done and what you've just got a little glimpse of in the 1980s and the early 1990s. I've been allocated half an hour to speak, and I'm sure that you do not want, I don't want, to fill it up with a litany of all of the misery that this government of millionaires is planning to heap down on us. Because you've only got to switch on the TV every day to hear the latest thing. As Claire will talk about later on Monday you're going to hear the report of the Brown Review, which will massively increase tuition fees. And Lord Brown, of course, is a multi-millionaire, the ex-head of the BP oil company. Tomorrow we'll get the Hutton Review, which will slash public sector pensions, force public sector workers in all likelihood to work until they're 65. Lord Hutton, of course, retired himself on 2/3 of his final salary as a law lord, and I don't know how much that was, but I bet it was a lot more than 99% of public sector workers earn. And of course, on the 20th of October, as Suzanne referred to, then we're going to get George Osborne's comprehensive spending review, which will be massive cuts across every single part of the public sector and public services. And he's been helped, he's a multi-millionaire himself, but he's pulled in Philip Green, the head of the Arcadia, the retail group, to help decide what to cut. That man is worth 4.1 billion and lives in the tax haven of Monaco, and it's him that's going to be helped to decide which of our public services are going to be cut. And these will be, as Suzanne has said, like nothing that any of us have ever seen. Even those of us who were old enough to have been, even if I was a school student, thanks Suzanne for mentioning that, but who were old enough to have been around in the 1980s, we didn't see anything like the cuts that this government is planning. You have to go all the way back to the 1920s to see cuts in public services on the scale that this government is going to carry out. And we've already had a little glimpse, haven't we, with the Suffolk Tory Council basically saying they're going to privatise every single service, with Birmingham making all 28,000 workers, apart from education workers, redundant or threatening to make them redundant in order to force through changes in their terms and conditions. 8,500 workers in Sheffield threatened with redundancy. So this is even before the comprehensive spending review. You're already seeing huge cuts in public services. This is not trimming the fat or cutting bureaucracy or getting rid of a few supposedly pointless backroom staff. This is trying to wind the clock back to the 1930s. It will mean the complete closure of huge swathes of the public sector, of old age people's homes, of childcare services, of libraries. It is going to mean devastating cuts that will affect absolutely everybody. And it would mean, if they got away with it, a return to the 1930s. But they are not going to get away with it. They will not be able to implement cuts on the scale they are talking about without a massive fight back and response from the population. This condemned government have made the same mistake that Maggie Thatcher made when she introduced the poll tax that was talked about in that little film. Thatcher was known as the Iron Lady, and her government did take on and defeat the working class a number of times. But the movement against the poll tax reduced her to iron filings. The poll tax was got rid of, and she was thrown out of office. And it was because they made the mistake for the first time, instead of just taking on one group of workers, one group of people, they took on everybody at once. And there was a united movement against what the government was trying to do. Well, they've only just been elected, and they're already making the same mistake again, because, I mean, there are many differences, and I'll mention some of them, between the poll tax and the cuts that we are now facing. The poll tax was one tax. It was a tax, for those of you that don't remember it, where Nicholas Ridley, the Tory minister at the time, summed it up by saying whether you're a duke or a dustman, you pay exactly the same. So it's a flat rate tax. And it was terrible, but it was only one thing, whereas this time we're facing hundreds of different cuts taking place at the same time. But it is the same in the sense that absolutely everybody will be affected. Let's be clear about this. Unless you are rich enough to pay for your children's education, to pay for private healthcare, to pay to have the street outside your house cleaned, unless you never use your local library, never think you're going to need the National Health Service, then you will be worse off as a result of these cuts. So it's the whole of the working class, but it's also a big section of middle class people who are going to be much worse off as a result of the cuts that are threatened. And so, just as in the poll tax, there is going to be the possibility of a mass movement, millions strong, that can defeat this government. We said at the time of the poll tax that even if there'd been no socialists, even if there'd been no attempt to organise the movement against the poll tax, there still would have been mass protests, riots and other demonstrations taking place against the tax. There still would have been people who'd refused to pay it because they just couldn't afford to pay it. The difference would have been that the movement was incoherent and unorganised. Well, you can say it's the same this time. Even if we weren't in this room tonight, even if socialists weren't trying to organise an anti-cuts movement, there will be protests against these cuts. There is no way that everybody is just going to accept their job going, their school having teachers cut, their nursery closing down and so on. People are going to protest and fight back. We could see riots, not like the riots of the 1980s actually, but more like the riots of the 1930s, which were bread riots, because people literally couldn't put food on the table, and you could see riots of a similar kind taking place again. But the point that we make is to succeed, a movement has to be organised. Rioting, smashing up your own community is not the best way to fight back. You need an organised movement. And that's what we were able to do in the poll tax. If you look at mass media now, they make out that the big demonstration, which was actually only ever a riot because the police viciously attacked it, but they make out that that big demonstration was what defeated the poll tax, that riots were what defeated the poll tax. But it's not true. What defeated the poll tax was an organised mass movement which by the end had 18 million people refusing to pay the tax. We led that movement, and we think it's possible to organise a similar kind of movement, not non-payment this time, but a similar kind of movement in the coming months and years.